26 October, 1962, U.S. President Kennedy ordered his State Department to prepare for crash programs. They were about to invade Cuba. He said, "We will invade Cuba. We shall occupy Cuba. We shall establish a civil government there." Over the next few hours, when this news reached the Cuban Prime Minister Fidel Castro, he wrote a letter to the Soviet Union, informing them of the report that the USA may attack them anytime. This attack could be in two forms. First, they would carry out a limited airstrike on Cuba. Or second, they would execute a full-scale invasion of Cuba. If they went with the second option, it would be so disastrous for Cuba, but in order to avoid it, they considered a preemptive nuclear strike on the US. Cuba wanted the Soviet Union to drop a nuclear bomb on the USA to prevent the Cuban invasion. Next day, on 27 October, becomes one of the most dangerous days in human history. It is later known as the Black Saturday. Not only was there a pressing danger of World War III, but it also foreshadowed that the Third World War would be a nuclear war. Around noon, an American U-2 aircraft entered the Cuban airspace. On the order of a local Cuban commander, a missile was fired at the plane and brought it down. U.S. pilot Rudolph Anderson died in the impact. During this time, the U.S. Navy warships deployed on the sea found out that there were Soviet Union submarines near Cuba. Many people didn't know this for years, that these submarines carried nuclear bombs too. The same day, on the 27th of October, the U.S. Navy warship located the B-59 Soviet Union submarine. And they start attacking the submarine. Signaling depth charges, a type of explosive, were dropped on the submarine. Keep in mind, it played out in international waters. Soviet Union officers in B-59 thought that the war had begun once they were under attack. In a submarine, the situation is dire, even on the calmest day. It is very hot due to the high temperatures. The carbon dioxide levels are high. And if we talk about this specific B-59 submarine, when they were under attack, they lost contact with Moscow. They had no remaining way to communicate with their higher commander. Their radio stops functioning too, effectively cutting them off from the news of the world. Because they thought that the war had begun, Captain Valentin Savitsky exclaims that they would blast off their opponents, even if they die. They will first sink the enemies. The most shocking thing here is that these officers present in the submarine had the authority to launch the nuclear weapons at their discretion. They didn't need to wait for orders from superiors. If they judged that the situation had become out of control, they could use discretion to launch the nuclear bombs and the nuclear missiles. And they prepared their submarine to launch a nuclear attack on the USA. The nuclear missile in the submarine was as intense as the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Had the officers in the submarine launched the nuclear missiles, it would have been the beginning of a nuclear war. Today, this event is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. What was the background? Why did this situation arise? And what happened next? In 1898, Cuba got independence from Spain. For 370 years before this, there was Spanish rule in Cuba. Cuba was a Spanish colony. That year, there was a war between Spain and the US, and Spain lost the war. But Cuba didn't become independent just yet. From 1898 to 1902, Cuba remained under the military occupation of the US. In 1902, the Republic of Cuba was proclaimed, claiming that they were independent of the USA. But that wasn't a proper freedom. Even after that, Cuba remained a satellite state of the USA. According to the new Cuban Constitution, America had the right to impose restrictions on Cuban foreign policies. In 1934, a treaty was signed, according to which Cuba had to hand over its naval bases to America, and no other country could build naval bases in Cuba. The situation worsened in 1952, when Fulgencio Batista became the dictator of Cuba with help from America. In Cuba, the American government started promoting the interests of private American companies. The situation was so dire that in 1959, 40% of the sugar lands in Cuba were owned by American companies. Nearly all the cattle ranches in the country were under the control of American companies. 90% of the mines were owned by American companies. 80% of the utilities were owned by American companies. And practically, nearly the entire oil industry in Cuba was in the hands of the American companies too. There was stark income inequality, high unemployment and poverty in the country. It was a wonderful time for the rich, but for a common Cuban, healthcare was nearly non-existent. Typhoid, tuberculosis, intestinal parasites, such diseases had become quite common among the masses. In addition to it, prostitution, gambling, and drugs had become a major problem in Cuba. Corruption was rampant, and Batista himself was linked to the underworld. Due to these reasons, there was a communist Cuban revolution in Cuba, led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Fidel Castro seized all U.S. property and started nationalizing it. More than 380 businesses, including oil refineries, distilleries, coffee plantations, sugar mills, department stores, textile factories, railways, everything falls under the Cuban government. They are taken away from U.S. private companies. How does America react to these steps? America wasn't pleased with it at all. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower declared an embargo so that all trades and businesses with Cuba could be cut off. 2/3 of the American imports into Cuba were stopped. In January 1961, the USA stopped recognizing the Cuban government. The U.S. Embassy in Cuba was closed, and all diplomatic relations are cut off. On 20th January 1961, a new U.S. president was elected, John F. Kennedy. U.S. had already cut off all their business and diplomatic ties with Cuba, and John F. Kennedy kept it the same way. But U.S. did not stop there. U.S. was adamant about invading Cuba. In April 1961, America secretly financed and trained more than 1,500 Cuban exiles, those who were against Fidel Castro. America's plan was that these 1,500 people would go to Cuba, invade Cuba with the weapons provided by America, so that they could overthrow Fidel Castro's government. This was a secret plan. There's a place near the southwestern coast of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. The armed exiles were supposed to land there. But as soon as the rebels landed in Cuba, they were spotted by some local fishermen. These local fishermen were armed with rifles, and they started firing at the rebels. The firing alerted the Cuban military, and soon the Cuban Air Force reached the spot. The rebels had some air support from the U.S., but when it became clear that they would lose, the U.S. backed away from the invasion, because John F. Kennedy didn't want the world to know that the U.S. was behind the invasion. He wanted to keep this invasion a top secret. The U.S. backed down at a critical moment, and Fidel Castro took charge over this operation, and the battle was over within 3 days. The invasion had failed. This failed Bay of Pigs invasion became an infamous episode of America's foreign policy. America wanted to reduce the influence of the Soviet Union, but after this failed invasion, Cuba started looking up to the Soviet Union even more. There was a simple reason behind it. Cuba wanted to protect the country. Cuba didn't want to be invaded by the U.S., and which country could protect it? U.S.'s rival, the Soviet Union. Since both countries had communism, that impacted their decisions too. U.S. didn't stop there. This became an issue of egos for the Kennedy government. In November 1961, America carried out another operation, the Operation Mongoose. The objective of this operation was the same as before, to overthrow the communist Cuban government. But this time, they chose different tactics, a more devious plan. They planned to set up a pirate radio station, backed by the CIA. Anti-Castro propaganda would be aired on this radio. In addition to this, there was another plan, called Operation Northwoods. According to this, some friendly Cubans would be selected, they'd wear the uniform of the Cuban army, and they would be told to attack the U.S.'s Guantanamo base in Cuba. They planned on staging the attack on an empty American ship, and then this attack would then be used as an excuse to show that Cuba had attacked America, and so America would justify declaring war on Cuba. If you think this is devious, there was an even more devious plan recommended by the Joint Chief of Staff of the U.S. He wanted to attack American cities such as Miami, Florida. They'd stage terrorist attacks. The U.S. would stage it, and then blame them on the Cuban government. The Americans would naturally believe that it was done by Cuba, and then they would use that as an excuse for conducting large-scale military operations on Cuba. Can you imagine attacking your own cities, your own people? Apart from this, there were numerous assassination attempts on Fidel Castro by America and the CIA. There were so many assassination attempts that he is said to be the person with the highest number of assassination attempts. It is difficult to have an exact count, but according to several sources, there were more than 600 assassination attempts on him. Some of the assassination attempts became famous, like when there was an attempt to poison his cigar. 2 gangsters from FBI's top 10 most wanted list were hired to assassinate him. There was a filmy attempt too. Castro's lover was a CIA agent told to mix deadly pills in his drinks. Chemical, fungus, and poison needles were also included in some plans. Coming back to our story, on 15 October 1962, America's U-2 aircraft, a spy plane, was carrying out its routine surveillance. It took a secret photo of a Cuban island. The photo showed that the Soviet Union's nuclear missiles were found on this Cuban island. Some time ago, in August, the USA was suspicious that the Soviet Union and Cuba were joining forces. When the USA discovered the nuclear missiles, the Kennedy government did not want the world to know that the US had found out about the Soviet Union's nuclear missiles in Cuba. So Kennedy formed a secret group of advisors, named ExComm. They had long, secret meetings to discuss the future course of action, about what they could do about the nuclear missiles discovered in Cuba. Several options were discussed. One option was to do nothing. US's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, said that the US owned more than 5,000 nuclear warheads, whereas the Soviet Union had only 300 nuclear warheads, and there were about 40 discovered in Cuba, bringing the total to 340. He said that since the US had many times the number of nuclear bombs than the Soviet Union, there was no need to worry about it. But the other members of ExComm claimed that the political balance of power was changing, and they had to take some action, or else the US citizens may be disappointed in them. They were also concerned about how the NATO allies would look at them if they didn't do anything in the situation. The second option here was to give a secret offer to Fidel Castro, that either Fidel Castro removed the nuclear missiles from Cuba, or America would invade Cuba. This was a way to create diplomatic pressure. The third option was to directly invade Cuba without any offer. The Joint Chief of Staff was favoring the third option. He wanted to use the Army, Marines, Air Force, Navy, all military forces, for a full-on invasion of Cuba. But President John F. Kennedy cautioned him that if they directly invaded Cuba and destroy the missiles, would the Soviet Union do nothing? They would retaliate in some way. And they could do it in Berlin. If you remember, at this time, Berlin was divided into two parts, one of which was under US influence, and the other under Soviet Union's influence. So someone recommended a fourth option, carrying out airstrikes at the sites of the nuclear missiles, to destroy the nuclear missiles, without a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Choosing this option would have been the most dangerous for America, because America had discovered only 40 nuclear warheads. Actually, there were 180 nuclear warheads in Cuba, and there were 4 nuclear submarines of the Soviet Union deployed around Cuba. Had the USA carried out an airstrike, Cuba and the Soviet Union could have used the rest of the nuclear missiles, and a nuclear war would have broken out. So which option did America choose finally? America decided to execute a naval blockade. They planned to surround Cuba on the sea with American Navy ships. Doing so, they would cut off the Soviet Union from sending more weapons to Cuba. And then, they could make a demand on the Soviet Union to take back all its nuclear weapons. This is what America does on 22nd October. But there was a small problem with this option. Putting up a naval blockade is also seen as an act of war. Once the US President Kennedy announced a naval blockade, the Soviet Union and Cuba would have considered it an act of war. That's why in his television address about it, Kennedy used the word quarantine instead of naval blockade. With the declaration of this quarantine, the US military had started preparing for war. B-59 bomber planes were ordered to remain airborne, ready for war. The Joint Chief of Staff had issued the alert for DEFCON 3. DEFCON stands for Defense Condition. There are 5 levels of the DEFCON alerts. DEFCON 5 means normal, peacetime, so that the military could be as ready as it normally is. When there is no war in the country, and there's overall peace, it is DEFCON 5. DEFCON 1 means the military needs to be prepared to the maximum to launch an attack at a moment's notice. US President Kennedy signed to change the alert to DEFCON 3. The Strategic Air Command in America and the Air Defense Command, their commanders have the right to change the DEFCON levels at their discretion. The next morning, on 23rd October, they changed it to DEFCON 2, without President Kennedy's approval. Kennedy and his staff were infuriated at this, because the world would perceive it to mean that the USA is prepared to attack, that they can start a war at any moment. DEFCON 2 meant that the USA was preparing its missiles to attack the Soviet Union. President Kennedy started worrying about how to de-escalate the crisis, since they had escalated things too much. The next day, 24th of October, the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, responded to this by saying that the blockade declared by America was an act of aggression, and the Soviet Union ships that were headed towards Cuba wouldn't be withdrawn by the Soviet Union. But at the same time, he said that they did not want a war. They simply wanted America to get a taste of their own medicine. From their perspective, placing nuclear missiles in Cuba was a strategic defense tactic, because America was doing the same in the countries around the Soviet Union, such as in Turkey and Italy. America had already placed its nuclear missiles there. With the Soviet ships getting closer to American warships, the world held its breath, curiosity over what would happen if the American ships and Soviet ships start firing at each other, if that would be the start of another war. But thankfully, nothing of the sort happened. When the Soviet ships reached the quarantine line, some ships turned around, and others that had no offensive weapons. But then, on 25th of October, CIA's director says that the nuclear missiles in Cuba had become operational, and that there was a need to be more alert. John F. Kennedy issued the National Security Action Memorandum, 199. With this, the nuclear weapons in the US and NATO countries were loaded, and they were ready to strike. Next morning, on 26th of October, US President Kennedy ordered the State Department to prepare for the crash program. America would invade Cuba. They would occupy Cuba and establish a civil government. This is the part of the story I talk about at the beginning of the video. As soon as Fidel Castro got news of Kennedy's secret preparations, he wrote a letter to Nikita Khrushchev, saying that America could attack them anytime, and if it turned out to be a full-scale invasion, they need to launch a nuclear attack on America to prevent it from happening. Later, in 2010, when Fidel Castro was interviewed, he regretted his position. He said that he shouldn't have written so. He said that what he said in the highly tense situation was not worth it, and he shouldn't have said so. But back in 1962, the Cuban military was given orders. If they saw any American aircraft in the Cuban airspace, the military should immediately open fire at it, to shoot it down. Amidst these events, the US President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Khrushchev were trying to maintain some diplomacy, but do remember that it was the 1960s. It took about 12 hours to send a telegram, so it wasn't easy communicating with each other immediately. The entire world was looking at them, but the world wasn't aware of the two secret communication channels between the two. The back channel, through which the politicians around the world can secretly communicate with each other. Today, it is considered unethical, and the countries don't do it any longer, but it was common back then. John F. Kennedy and his brother, the Attorney General of the USA, Robert F. Kennedy, were holding secret meetings with Georgy Bolshakov, a Russian intelligence officer living in the USA. There was another KGB officer, Alexander Feklisov. These meetings were aimed at coming up with a compromise. There was a huge advantage of the back channel. Kennedy and Khrushchev could both pretend for their citizens that they were ready to fight each other and defeat the enemy. The public speeches and warmongering placed in front of the public stayed out of the back channel. They could genuinely try to keep the peace. Alexander Feklisov and John Ascali were having lunch together on 26th of October. It was then that Feklisov told Scali that the war may break out at any moment. But if Scali could talk to his high-level friends in the US government, there could be a diplomatic solution. He lays down an offer for the US government. The Soviet Union was ready to dismantle the bases in Cuba under the supervision of the United Nations. Fidel Castro would promise to not allow any offensive weapons in his country, and in exchange, the US would have to promise that they will not invade Cuba ever. The same evening, the US State Department received a long, emotional letter. It is said to be personally written by Nikita Khrushchev. This letter contained the same offer to the US that Feklisov talked about during lunch. John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy read this letter very carefully, and then they released it to the media, awaiting for an official acceptance of this offer from Russia. But the next day turned out to be one of the most dangerous days in human history. The Black Saturday. I mentioned this at the beginning of the video too. 12 minutes into the day, at 12:12 a.m., the USA informed its NATO allies countries that the situation was worsening, and they should be prepared for any military action they might have to take. At 6 a.m., the CIA reported that 5 of the 6 missile sites in Cuba were operational, and that the Cuban military was preparing for war. However, they were ordered not to initiate attacks until the other side attacked first. At 9 a.m., the Soviet Union government replied. Radio Moscow broadcasted a message from Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev said that they agreed with the offer, but they had an additional condition. The fourth condition, on which their acceptance depended. The fourth condition was that the nuclear missiles placed by the US and Turkey needs to be removed, as it was near the Soviet Union. Khrushchev said that the US was worried about the missiles in Cuba, even though it was 90 miles from the US, while Turkey shared a border with the Soviet Union, and the US had placed nuclear missiles on Soviet Union's border. 2 hours later, at 11 a.m., Khrushchev repeated the same offer, and 1 hour later, at noon, an American U-2 aircraft entered Cuban airspace. As the Cuban military was ordered They shot down the aircraft, and the pilot Rudolf Anderson died in it. ExComm assumed that the Soviet Union had ordered the attack of shooting at the plane. And ExComm believes that the Soviet Union wanted a war. Around the same time, a US Navy warship spotted a B-59 submarine and starts attacking it. The USA had continued the naval blockade, and the Russian ships were allowed to move freely, especially if it was carrying weapons. When this submarine was attacked, Captain Valentin exclaimed, "The submarine was carrying nuclear weapons." And the officers in the submarine had the authority to launch it. The submarine had lost contact with the outside, and their radio wasn't working either. They weren't receiving any news. Neither could they communicate with their commanders. Two of the officers give their approval for the launch of the nuclear missiles, because from their perspective, the war had already begun. But they needed the approval of another officer in the submarine, Vasily Arkhipov, the chief of staff of the 4 submarines. He showed immense courage and said that they wouldn't launch any nuclear missiles. He calms down the other 2 officers and tried to convince them that there was no need to jump into launching nuclear weapons so soon, because he believed that there was a chance that the war hadn't broken out, and if they started launching nuclear weapons, there would be a nuclear war in the world because of them. Arkhipov was successful in convincing the other officers. U.S. President John F. Kennedy was under increasing pressure because a U.S. pilot had died. The U.S. president had to decide whether to retaliate or not. There was huge pressure from the media. The citizens were furious over it. Since their pilot was killed, they wanted to attack Cuba. They wanted to exact revenge on the enemy. But despite tremendous pressure, around 4 p.m., U.S. President Kennedy says that they would continue the negotiations, that the demand placed by the Soviet Union was valid, and that they would try to remove the missiles from Turkey. This caused Turkey to put pressure on the U.S., because Turkey didn't want the missiles to be withdrawn. It was difficult to convince the other NATO countries too. Although Italy agrees to remove the U.S. nuclear missiles from the country, the negotiations continue. People all around the world were holding their breaths. That night, there was a secret meeting between Robert Kennedy and Russian ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. In this secret meeting, both of them arrived at a compromise. Robert Kennedy says that they would remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy, but they would do so secretly, because the U.S. government did not want to be pressured by the people, so they opted to do it secretly, and asked the Soviet Union to refrain from declaring publicly that they removed the missiles from Turkey and Italy, because it wouldn't be accepted publicly. The Russian ambassador agreed to it. This negotiation would result in damage to Nikita Khrushchev's image. Khrushchev would have to publicly withdraw his 4th demand, even though it would be fulfilled secretly. But Khrushchev's public image would take a huge hit. His citizens would think that he had bowed down to the USA. Nikita Khrushchev would be publicly seen as losing this war. He'll seem to be in a losing position. Only he and some US top officials would know that he would be the hero who prevented World War III. Next day, 28 October, Khrushchev accepted the sacrifice. He broadcasted a message on Radio Moscow that the Soviet Union had accepted America's demands. And soon, the Soviet Union takes back the nuclear missiles in Cuba. The US promised not to invade Cuba ever. Operation Mongoose was stopped. The naval blockade ends the next month. And secretly, America takes back the nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. 25 years later, this secret is revealed to the world. 2 additional actions were also taken to de-escalate the tensions between the Soviet Union and the USA. First, the following year, in June 1963, a hotline was established for instant communication between the Kremlin and the White House, and they wouldn't need to wait for hours to send telegrams. Second, on 25th of July 1963, a limited nuclear test ban treaty was signed by the 2 countries, so that there wouldn't be a repeat of the Cuban nuclear escalation. But there isn't a happy ending to our story. The citizens of both countries believed the warmongering. Under the media's influence, many people in these countries believed that the other country was an enemy that needed to be wiped out. Many people were angry with John F. Kennedy's response. And Khrushchev's image, as I told you, he had to sacrifice his image completely. His fellow citizens believed that he had compromised the country's integrity and had placed the Soviet Union at the mercy of the USA. In November 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. He was killed. It is believed that the assassin was angry about the Cuba situation, with Kennedy's response to the Cuban crisis. On the other hand, 2 years later, Nikita Khrushchev was overthrown by his political opponents in the Soviet Union. These two are the heroes in our story. Along with the Robert Kennedy and Robert McNamara in the US and in the Soviet Union, along with Nikita Khrushchev, Alexander Feklisov, and perhaps the biggest hero was Vasily Arkhipov, the commander of the submarines, who refrained from using the launch button. Despite huge pressure from the US military, Kennedy did not go ahead with the invasion. People look at this crisis from the USA versus Russia perspective, looking at it as a battle between two countries. But actually, the perspective here is of war versus peace. People who demanded war and people who wanted to maintain peace. Many people compare the Cuban Missile Crisis with the current Russian-Ukraine conflict, claiming that Russia's actions in Ukraine are right because the same thing happened in Cuba. The US's actions in Cuba were also justified because the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. With the same logic, the actions of Russia in Ukraine are wrong because Ukraine wants to be a part of NATO. However, there are no American missiles in Ukraine. Even so, Putin is such a warmonger that he invaded Ukraine. As it happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Putin had the option of diplomacy too, to maintain peace. There could have been secret meetings aiming for peace, but these didn't happen, because in this case, Putin actually wants to occupy Ukraine. If there's a lesson in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is that Russia's actions are entirely wrong. What do you think? You can comment below to let me know. Thanks for watching.